Welcome to the Common Ground podcast by Very Temporary. This is a podcast where we seek to develop a foundation of mutual understanding on a wide variety of topics relevant to our time. A bit about us at Very Temporary. Very Temporary is a community of thinkers based in Accra, Ghana, with a passion for promoting oneness, expression, progressive thinking, and an appreciation of life among individuals of African descent and the wider world. I'm William Ntim.
I'm Elikem Tamaklo.
I'm Nia Kuboidoku.
And on today's episode of the Common Ground podcast, we're going to be talking about meditation and mindfulness, specifically the potential of meditation and mindfulness in remedying afflictions related to one's mental health, and the things that could essentially get in the way of it or promote this as a widespread practice. So yeah, off we go. Mindfulness and meditation. Well, we're mainly piggybacking off the article we did, right, Ellie, and just where we went back and forth about whether mindfulness and meditation can work for everyone.
That's correct. Mm-hmm.
I think we all generally agree that it's powerful to an extent, but where there is some misalignment might be on the efficacy, on whether it could actually work for everyone. So I think we could dive right in. Ellie, you have the floor. Can meditation work for everyone?
Sure thing. So I think yes, to an extent. It's more of a nuanced thing in that it can work for most people if done correctly. And yes, there is a correct way to do meditation. But just like how medication doesn't work for every single person due to some things they're predisposed to or not, meditation also, I think, wouldn't work as well for people who are not doing it properly, number one. Number two, people who are, for one reason or another, not physically or mentally able to even start the process. I'm talking people who have chemical imbalances, people who have afflictions that are bigger than the average person, preventing them from meditating or getting benefit from the practice.
Mm-hmm. In general, I'm of the same view. It's like it comes down to it. I think we generally agree that it is possible, but whether everyone can kind of take advantage of it in the same way is where it gets a bit tricky. Neil, what do you think?
Yeah, similar thing with me as well. Like at some point in time, we have to consider like the lack of biology, right? So if you do have a brain tumor and that brain tumor is preventing you from meditating, sure, like meditation may not work for you. Although, I mean, it's not really an although as much as it is. It is hard to even determine if it's working for someone in the first place because you can't really escape your own mind to know how another person is feeling. I'll use this term that I really like, airdrop your feeling. You can't really airdrop feelings, and so it's hard to know. But for sure, yeah, the biology makes it difficult to. For
okay, let's back up for a second here and maybe find some common ground on this. Well, let's define meditation in the context in which we are speaking about it. What do we mean when we say meditation? Let's see if our views align on that. When I hear meditation, I in the basic sense, it's a very complex topic. There are books and volumes written on this, but in a very basic sense, it can easily be conflated with mindfulness in the sense it's essentially being aware of your thoughts and just spending time to kind of assess how you feel about certain things and everything that comes along with that. But it can be defined so differently by many different people. I mean, the dictionary definition says the action or practice of meditating. So what would meditating be in that sense? Thinking deeply or focusing on one's mind for a period of time. So, I mean, can we generally agree on that as the definition, or you feel like there's more to it than just that?
Well, I'll take a jab at this. I think meditation has to do more with the being present part of things, and mindfulness has to do more with the sort of like processing of those thoughts or lack thereof, and making sense of those things. So yeah, small distinction, but that's what I think.
Yeah, for me, I could use that definition. I think it still gets to the spirit of what we are talking about. Although when I think of meditation, that's when I think of the the actual practice, right, of sitting down and introspecting or paying attention to feelings. It's not, yeah, paying attention to how experience, whether it's sight, sound, how what thoughts are coming through, all of that. And mindfulness to me is now the act of doing this whenever, right? So with the meditation, it's kind of intentional, right? It's like your mind wanders and you're like, okay, bring it back to the breath, for example. But when you're being mindful, there is not as much of that pull back to the breath. It is simply like the watching, right? Say maybe now you're eating, so you are mindfully eating, right? Instead of maybe looking at your phone and eating at the same time, you are eating and you are aware of what the different sensations of the eating are. But in the meditation is the formal practice. That's how I'll define it.
The dictionary definition of mindfulness says the quality or state of being conscious or aware of something. In this case, I would assume it's one's thoughts. So then the question becomes, in situations where someone might be suffering from some kind of mental affliction that is affecting their emotional well-being, what are the potential advantages of this kind of practice? I mean, it seems pretty clear, like that if one can be introspective enough and meditate enough and be mindful enough, they can get to the root of these like emotional afflictions and see and understand why they feel those ways about whatever it is they are feeling and identifying the root of it. So I mean, in theory, it sounds pretty simple. Like, of course, anyone should be able to like assess how they feel about something and then easily neutralize and integrate it. But in practice, it really doesn't come across that way. Any ideas as to why that is? Because in theory, it really sounds so simple. Okay, yes, I feel this way. Let me be mindful and come into the now, and also spend more time assessing why I feel the way I feel, and then maybe integrating it from there. It sounds so simple, doesn't it? But like in practice, it really doesn't come off that way.
Yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I'll take a jab at this as well. So the human psyche and how people think and feel is a very, very complex, operation, if you will, that goes on in the human body and the brain, right? A lot of chemicals being thrown around and neurotransmitters that directly affect how you feel and how you perceive things, actually. So when you talk about feeling, let's say you have some kind of negative emotions or feelings, right? The average person, let's say, it's possible through meditation to be able to identify those feelings, identify why you're feeling those feelings, and find ways to either like change your attitude towards how you respond to them, or just sort of kill the root cause of the negative feelings, right? Now, when you have, say, some kind of chemical imbalance, let's say calcium deficiency or, a deficit of serotonin, I've been there before. And so I feel like I can speak to this, especially with the serotonin thing, where you might know why you're feeling a certain way because maybe you have chemical imbalance issues. But that in itself is not a good enough I don't want to say good enough reason, but that in itself is not helpful in helping you actually get out of that state, right? So there was one time, for some reason we're not even going to get into, I had a very serious dip in my serotonin levels. I'm generally a very happy-go-lucky guy. I see the good in things, even the most mundane things, or at least I try to, right? My favorite activity to do is the sunset, watching the sunset. So this one time where I had this dip in serotonin, I go sit in front of the sunset. I'm like, why was I ever happy to see this shit? Like, it really is basic, And I caught myself thinking that way, which was one thing because I'd been practicing some meditation. But even at that point, I couldn't justify why I felt happy seeing the sunset in the first place. At that point, I wouldn't say I was sad, but it was a big delta from how I felt before, how happy and elated I used to be, and then sitting down that day, warm sun on my face, and I was like, yeah, this shit is basic. So in that moment, I realized. In that moment,
Dude, that makes a lot of sense. Go ahead, go ahead.
Yeah, at the moment I realized that okay, I'm feeling this way. I can identify what I'm feeling, but like there was no getting out of this pit. It's
Yeah,
almost like
you know
yeah.
something you highlighted that's so true that relates to that is most people who are actually going through some kind of emotional trauma, they know what is worrying them. They are very aware of it. It's almost arrogant to think that you help them find out what it is. Who would understand the cause of their trauma better than the person who's experiencing it? You know, so most people know. So almost in a sense, just being aware of these underlying causes of these emotional imbalances somehow isn't enough. Like there's some requisite mental willpower to kind of pull yourself out of these situations. Like it's funny you mentioned that like there's something that I try to do myself where like personally this idea of just emotions being chemicals in your body, I personally took it and ran with it. At every point in time I do this fun game where I'm like, ooh, let me guess the percentage of each. Like I wonder what's the serotonin to whatever other chemical ratio in my body. And I've really like trivialize it down to that sense because it is what it is. It is the truth. At any given point, we're a walking cocktail of like chemicals which result in your reaction, and it kind of helps you get out of it. You don't take life too seriously. Sometimes I'm there, I'm like and a bit upset. I'm like, ooh, serotonin levels down or something like. I'm like, I joke around with it, and it's like it's quite effective because I've kind of like juxtaposed the experience from the awareness behind it. You see, so you create that gap, and it makes you. I guess it makes it easier to practice or gain more benefits out of this. But going back to your point is that yeah, simply being aware of it isn't enough. So what are the things, Nia? Maybe you can like elaborate more on this. What are the things that get in the way of getting from that point of okay, I know what is bothering me, but how am I going to like get to that point where I know I want to get? Like pulling yourself from that the depths, like to so like for you, Ellie, in that sense, to be like, how do you get from instantly knowing that okay, no, listen, I know I enjoy watching sunsets. Something is clearly wrong here. Like and it's snapping yourself out of that into that point. It might not be a snap, but even if you had to do it over time, what are the things that get in the way?
So, like, one thing that sort of almost a disclaimer is for meditation and mindfulness in general, I think changing what experience is like, right, is not the goal, right? Which in some sense is advertised as the goal, that you would feel better, right, because you meditate. For me, I see it more like a byproduct. The fact that experience can change from meditating or from sort of having an insight into what it's like, right? So having some curiosity about the experience, like what William said about, oh, serotonin levels low. Like as much as that doesn't not necessarily directly change the experience, as a byproduct of him sort of objectifying experience in this way, it almost has a refreshing feeling. So that's the byproduct that makes meditation really useful, in my opinion. And so coming back to the question of what makes it difficult, it's almost like, and this guy Sam Harris uses this example a lot. It's almost like being anxious to give a public talk, right? Initially, like you can become as mindful as you want to be about the anxiety that is causing you to not be able to give this talk, right? But then the solution is not more mindfulness. At some point in time, the solution is not more mindfulness. The solution is what are you actually
It might even hinder it.
Exactly. The solution is what are you actually going to do about it. The thing that mindfulness does, in my opinion, is it gives some clarity, right? Because you have more insight, and the insight is sort of objectified, like as William said, it's sort of objectified, and so you feel less implicated every time, say, something happens, right? It feels less like your fault. It feels less like something that you really have to change immediately. It just feels like you're a passive observer, right, of what's going on, and that gives a good that gives good insight into what's happening. As to how you change it, the solution may simply be practicing more, being anxious, like putting yourself in more of these positions where you are anxious, and then slowly like becoming better through practice, right? Because those chemical imbalances that we have no insight into, some of it is even determined by is this something you are fearful
genetics,
of? Exactly.
literally, or even things beyond your control.
So many things beyond our control. So it's really the insight, I think, that
Even your diet can affect like these things. Like, one
exactly.
thing that I'm thinking about now is like, how I found that it's a very effective tool to kind of abstract myself from the emotions I feel. And going back to the whole concept of meditation, I mean, if you trace the pioneers of these, more or less we could call them Eastern traditions, because that's where they all pretty much started. It goes back to these ideas, and you can find traits of it in Buddhism and whatnot, of kind of detaching yourself, removing yourself from the experience. I mean, in practice, you don't want to go full on detached, because I mean we are living in a world with people, but and you have to be functional. But creating that gap, that space, is kind of at the core of so many of these teachings regarding meditation, and kind of applying it kind of makes it more effective to get the fruits out of the experience, because if you can abstract the experience from it, then you can react more maturely. Sometimes, for instance, like if you are in an emotional state that you don't particularly enjoy, and perhaps and you get better clarity on the necessary actions you need to take once you kind of remove yourself emotionally. But that is very hard to do, because we live in a world that conditions us to kind of really, really become fond of our attachments and our identity and our egos and all of that. So it's very hard to really remove yourself from your own situation enough to have an objective viewpoint on it. Because sometimes, there's this thing people notice where it's like, you always give good advice to others, but like people cannot take that same advice for themselves. It's like when you are giving someone else the advice, you created that gap. It's like, oh, this is clear what you should do. Like, you should easily do this. Duh. Like, but when it comes to your own stuff, it's very hard to remove yourself enough to come to an objective conclusion on the course of action. So I think I just wanted to highlight that it's funny, because where the roots of these kind of practices came from, this element of detachment and awareness of one's thoughts, and all these Zen Buddhist practices are a very core part of it. It's very difficult to detangle for me, but at the same time, you don't want to assume that you cannot necessarily gain the full benefits of mindfulness and meditation without embracing all those practices. You don't want to say that too, but just pointing that out, that there seems to be a connection there in that point.
Yeah, one other thing I fully agree with what you said. One other thing I want to add to make what makes it one of the things that may make it difficult is this. Like, one reason humans are different from most other animals, right, is our ability to sort of tell stories, right? We, like, with even the creation of language, right, some of the things that we say, like maybe I am angry, right, I am anxious, I feel this way, right, a lot of this does not necessarily, it's not precise enough, right? It's just an abstract, like it's just a way to sort of approximate what we think our experience is based on how we understand the word. But then that's what has made words like super some way, because the stories are good if you can create a good story. Say your story is, I was shit at school my entire life, and then in IB2 I made a 10 and then things were good, right? That's someone's good story. But then someone else could change the story, similar story, right? But I was shit my entire life. IB2, I kind of like managed to make it, but the entire story of my life has been being shit, right? All of those, in some sense, don't actually have any real meaning, right? But because of this, we feel so attached to words and language that it can almost feel very real most of the time, right? And so it kind of becomes this, I don't know if I'm using the word right, but self-fulfilling prophecy of us sort of continually convincing ourselves of maybe why we should be feeling what we are feeling, right? And with that separation, it's easier to notice that, oh wait, no, like I don't have to be angry, or whatever justification I have for anger is just words, right? Whatever justification I have for hating this person, it really is just words, but how I feel does not necessarily match that.
You see, that's what the kind of point I was trying to make when I said, in theory, it sounds so simple. You realize that, okay, I feel this way. I can change my mind. Technically, you can change your mind at any time. But what is it that is getting you to believe in the current story, as you put it, that you are telling yourself so much that you cannot even get yourself to believe the new story? Is it like a deep attachment, ego? We've just been conditioned to really believe in this story so much. I mean, we
The
build our
ego,
whole
for sure.
identities.
It's one huge one.
I mean, exactly. It's something that we'll probably like come back to again and again in this conversation, where it's like, listen, we dwell on this idea of self, and we are not as evolved enough as we should be to realize how transient and fluid the whole concept of self is. So we get people end up in traumatic events, and they kind of associate their identity with that trauma. Like, I am the abuse. I've been abused. Ooh, I've been like, it is that it polarizes their whole identity. They cannot see themselves beyond that. And mind you, I'm trivializing it because some experiences are so potent that that shit will leave a mark. But the point I'm trying to make is that mark is not, you are the one letting it stick. But I don't want to dwell too much on that because it could rob it kind of robs understanding. It kind of robs you of empathy for the actual lived experience. It's very easy to say.
Yeah, and I just want to add something to that. Like what both of you are saying, very, very spot on. And William, what you just said about like us subscribing to a certain narrative of maybe who we're supposed to be or how we're supposed to feel, be it through the words, limited words we have to describe feelings, or maybe through our egos being, getting involved in these like thought processes. It's definitely interesting, yeah, and rightly so, very complex to sort of get to the bottom to really understand this. But like what Nibo was saying, mindfulness meditation gives you a window into what may be happening, right? And then it's up to you to figure out, okay, what next? Now, I'm going to use the rest of the story to highlight what I did next after feeling shitty that day. I realized after closing my eyes, like literally, like I tried to really be in the moment and realized, okay, something is fighting me here. And I'm usually a happy guy. What's going on earlier? Like I spoke to myself and I realized I was just like, yeah, of course, like I felt different because of what had happened a few days prior. And I was allowing that to narrate or like tell the story of the days following, like my story of the days following. And so what I did, and this may have been jumping ship, I pretended to be happy. I pretended to be happy. I
That's
smiled at
the secret.
myself.
That's the secret.
Yeah, I got up and there was an extra bounce in my step. I opened the door very aggressively but happily. I walked down the whole hallway, flinging and flailing my arms. Like I probably looked very mad and stupid to someone watching me from the outside. But I pretended to be happy. I went in, watched my favorite movie, drank my favorite rosé. But later on, when things went back to normal, I looked back and I was like, all right, so I could pretend to be happy. I could sort of fake it till I made it, almost because I knew that this thing was going to end, right? And I could suppress my ego for that short amount of time because I knew, it's going to end. Let me just make these next few days or next few hours or however long it was, let me just pretend to be happy and I will cross. Is that a sustainable thing
And
to do? I do not know.
that makes a lot of sense because I was thinking, you think of just life in general. That you said you pretended. I'm here thinking like, listen, we are always pretending at any given point. This life is a performance. Like you don't want to. Like I said, we are functional. We have to be functional in this society. So you can't be switching up every now and then. You have to have some semblance of consistency just to be relatable to people. But in general, you are performing. Like the way you act when you're in the office is not the way you act at a party. It's like you put on different coats or different outfits for different scenarios. But we somehow convince ourselves that some things stay the same, But how do you know which things stay the same? It's like how did you assign that as something that's fixed, as opposed to being flexible? Because what you did early is actually like the hack of all hacks. It's something that I kept trying to dwell on in the conversation we had. That listen, you can change your mind is as easy as changing your mind. In theory, I keep saying in theory. Personally, for me, it's very practical because I spend a lot of hours on that detachment aspect because I realize that that's what you need to kind of master in order to get the most benefits out of this. Like instantly alchemizing new feelings because you are so removed from identifying with what is going on now. That no, listen, okay, I can feel how I want to feel simply because I want to feel this way. this is going, and honestly you could come off as mad, primarily because most of society and most of us don't particularly give ourselves that ability or think we can do that. Like, hey, like, who are you to change your mind about how you feel? Like, you were sad, yo, stay sad. I'm like, no, like, it's like, like, why would you want to do that? It's an unpleasant experience. You can just change your mind. But some people are too attached to like the L they took or the trauma. Like, I mean, like I said, I don't want to trivialize the trauma too much because it robs people of their actual painful lived experience. But I mean, we've all been through things. Not to equate trauma, because we are not about to do trauma Olympics here, but not to equate trauma, but everyone has been through something. It's like, and it's very difficult to compare because everyone's experience is very subjective. But people have been through things that would say that they rocked them, it rocked them hard, and they were able to come out of it through certain methods, through realizing that they did not like the emotional state they were in, through making conscious and deliberate efforts to get out of that by forcing themselves to change the narrative going on in their minds. That's changing of the narrative. That's the power. But it's not as easy. Some people are very, they don't, it doesn't come as easy for them. And I think that's what I keep trying to dwell at. Is it that there is a lack of recognition of that separation, or we get very lost in the story we're telling ourselves?
Yeah, I think it's very easy to get lost in the story we're telling ourselves, honestly, and it's a bit of both. It's hard and it's easy to get lost in the story we're telling ourselves. For me, one thing that sort of maybe can give some insight into how it changed for me, right? I understood it in theory for a long time, right? A long time, but it was throughout my experiences, you kind of notice that you are experiencing things that sort of have no direct causal, relationship, right? So like you can feel an emotion that is difficult to describe in words because you've never actually felt it before. You never had the need to find a word for it, right? For example, a feeling like the love for everyone in the world at the same time, all at once, right? A very fully loving, open heart, right? It's an emotion that I almost couldn't describe or think about in that sense. I thought love was like it wasn't a positive sum game, right? It was a zero sum game when initially, sort of that rocket ship that lets you see a peak and then you come back and then you are like, wait. So the story I kept telling myself about why I felt a certain way or why I did certain things do not necessarily match what my body itself is feeling, doing, seeing, experiencing, right? The stories of my experience and my experience themselves are different. And that's what sort of started convincing me that, okay, maybe then the depths of experience are much deeper than I think, right? And I'm maybe just always seeing the shallow end of what experience looks like.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
One thing that you mentioned that I thought was interesting is, this idea of what love is. For the longest time, thinking about this more and more, I realized that what most people define as love, they're actually referring to attachment. Love is more of an acceptance. It's more of acceptance. When most people refer to love, it's really a deep attachment that they're talking about. You realize that love is actually quite the opposite. It's more free. It's more liberating. It doesn't hold. Exactly. It just accepts. Love is still. It's like water, is fluid. You see, so but when most people define love, they are thinking more in the terms of attachments and things that they don't want to change. But that doesn't sound sustainable.
Yeah. And actually, this reminds me of something that's I saw in the notes that I want to bring up, which is like Maslow's hierarchy of needs kind of thing, which sort of in 2020, it kind of, this whole mindfulness meditation thing also feels a lot like some glorified stress ball, right? Where you download a bunch of apps and then you're feeling stress and then, you come back to your breath and then that's there for what meditation and mindfulness can do for you, right? And so, in that situation, I don't think it would work for everyone, right? Because for me, that's simply bring your attention back, right? It's simply, bring your attention back. But then there, in my opinion, is sort of the insight of noticing what experience is like, even when you're not trying to change it or you're not trying to do anything about it, right? What does your day to day actually feel like when you're even doing your most mundane things, when you're watching the TV and you are lost in the Netflix and time doesn't seem to be going? What does that feel like, right? And I think that's where the profundity can really come in. But then this glorified stress ball of, oh yeah, I sit and I breathe once in a while. Like, it doesn't really have this
Nee,
moving part of it.
I'm so glad you brought that up because me personally, this mindfulness and meditation is probably like one of the most important things in my life. I spend 80% or 90% of my time literally kind of practicing this and refining it. So when people kind of view it as a glorified stress ball, it's kind of jarring because like I recognize the amount of discipline. It has demanded so much out of me than I realized. It's not easy. Like I put in hours into that stuff, which is why like I can confidently acknowledge how much of the fruits I'm gaining from it because I know you put in work. But most people they dip their toes in it. They're like, what? I sat there for 10 minutes and my mind wasn't clear. And I think that's what's also affecting the branding
Yeah.
of mindfulness and meditation. People dip their toes in it like a few minutes and they're like, oh no, what? I'm not Zen. This is BS. All right, I'm out. Back to the drugs. Like,
Exactly.
and it's like that there's a disconnect between like what it actually takes to get to that point. And it's like even here on this side where like I devote a lot of my time to this. Every day I'm still learning things, learning newer ways to detach, learning newer ways to love, learning newer ways to be at peace with the now. It's a daily thing. It literally is in the word. It's a practice. It's a regimented activity where you need to commit yourself day to day and actually work on it day to day, improve and grow in your awareness and mindfulness and just control over your own psyche. It's like you are working a muscle of control, exerting more control over your amygdala. It's not something that happens overnight. You are literally rewiring your brain in a sense. So just wanted to stress on that it's definitely not some glorified stress ball that you cannot it doesn't come instantly and that's generally something that gets lost on. And I think perhaps that also is what turns people away from this because it seems so airy fairy, like, so if I sit down and cross my legs, and first of all, you don't even need to cross your legs to meditate. All these all these things that kind of like affect the branding of it and make it seem like a joke. Essentially, I think I just wanted to mention that's something that gets lost on people.
Yeah,
Nice.
that's actually a fully good point. And it again reminds me of back to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs where,
So,
yeah,
sorry to cut you, but I think this segues nicely into the next question, and just sort of
Go
to
for it. Go
mention it
for
so
it.
that anyone listening could keep on track. But basically, it's asking how Maslow's theory affects the practice and how people
Okay,
meditate.
can you start by running through Maslow's hierarchy? I think that would be
Yeah,
great to add to the convo.
awesome. I'll start
You have it up.
and I guess Nee
Mm-hmm.
can take it off.
sounds good.
So Maslow's theory is basically it's a theory of need that sort of stratifies or puts into different levels the human experience in relation to what humans focus on, depending on where they find themselves, sort of like in the food chain, if you will. So at the base, so the whole theory is the graphics are put into a pyramid, where at the base you have the broadest part, which has the most people or majority of people um, who are striving or trying to survive, right? From survival, you go towards, and it's not a silo or anything. It's more like a continuous thing where you go from survival to the pinnacle, which is like fully thriving, right? And when you're on the base, when you're surviving, there's certain things that you can or cannot pay attention to, versus when you're like thriving or somewhere in the middle of both these things. And so, relating to the points you guys were making, can we or do we meditate because we can? And I'll have Niboy take off from here.
Yeah, so Maslow's theory, Maslow's hierarchy, it makes it seem like there is some sort of prerequisites, right? Because I think at the top there is self-actualization, right? And self-actualization, a lot of people sort of like put it hand in hand with being able to sort of have that equanimity that people who meditate also seem to say they have, right? So it does seem like a pyramid, all right, and that you have to, yes, finish finding all your food, getting all your friends and all your sex and all those needs, then as it goes up all the way to self-actualization. I was listening to something recently that was actually talking about how Maslow's hierarchy is not so much a pyramid as it is sort of just a mix of Venn diagrams. But a pyramid is just a nice way to represent it, because it also doesn't, the prerequisites are not are not prerequisites in some sense. And to put it into context, most of what we know about meditation currently comes from like Buddhist and Eastern philosophy, right? And most of that happened even before Jesus, right? And if we think of how agriculture happened, that now we don't even need to think about food. I just Uber eats some pili pili Ghanaian chew dope, right? It's like I didn't have to think about that. I don't know anyone or many people who sort of have to think of the entire pipeline, right, of their food. But then just over 200 years ago, even 100 years ago, like more than 30 to 50% of the population were in the agricultural industry, right? And so if people who were Buddhists, right, from more than 3,000 years ago could meditate, I do think we can also meditate. But again, like now the world sort of has this linear definition of what it means to be free or successful or, living a good life, right? And so it does seem like here we need that hierarchy. But in some sense, I don't think they're as prerequisites as it needs to be. You can sort of mix all of them and not have one, I don't know.
That makes a lot of sense, but it goes back to something that I think Ellie were talking about some time back. Of course, what you're saying is 100% true, but I think it would be disingenuous to not recognize the fact that when some needs are staring you in the face, you cannot. If, for instance, if you are like, and Ellie brought this example, if you're like, say, a mother of like kids and like the kids don't have food, like when are you going to find your corner to sit there and go and like zen out? Like it seems irresponsible in a sense, but it makes sense. It's like you these things are distractions from the inner world. It's these things, like they pull you out of the now. And I think in the sense where Maslow's hierarchy comes in is that, okay, at the very least, certain things need to be off the forefront of your mind for you to focus, or even if they are actually physically there, if they are still there, you should be able to remove yourself from them in a sense. Because technically, if you think about it, everything on Maslow's hierarchy, basic needs, psychological needs, self-fulfillment needs, if you really hack your mind, you can achieve that without any actual tangible change in your life, just like reprogramming your mind to feel like, no, I'm at peace. I have everything I need. Like, I'm actualized. I'm where I want to be. Like you don't need to get things. You can get there. You can shortcut your mind through there if you can wield your mind in that way. You see, so it's mainly, I think, a metaphor for just having the space to remove yourself from the idea of needing something and wanting something, so that you can focus on what's really there. Because the idea is like, once you take all of those things away, you are left with what? Yourself. The inner world. And so that's where I think it comes in, that you need to get rid of those or kind of take care of those so that you can have time to see what else is really there. Then you realize all those things were kind of like illusory.
Yeah, that's one of the hard things about mindfulness too, is that it usually helps. Like you notice that it's helping only if you're already prepared, you've done the mindfulness before, you've done the meditation before, you have the insights, and then you face the situation that sort of would benefit from you being more mindful or you being, more detached from experience, right? So it's kind of hard, and I also don't want to make people like reduce the sort of the hardships that people are going through that makes it difficult for them to meditate or learn about any of these things. Although it's still one of those things where imagine they knew before they were in the situation they are in. It still sort of has that good effect, that beneficial effect. It's just that, yes, of course, like in the current life, it's hard to sort of find a slot in their life where you can take it out and then replace it with the learning and the mindfulness and all of that. But I think there's opportunity for it. So like thinking of our education system, thinking of the kinds of things we show on TV, thinking of the kinds of things we talk about, like this podcast right now, right? So like if we could integrate, I mean, maybe this is just wishful thinking, but if we could sort of integrate the knowledge of mindfulness and make it less like a glorified stress ball and more like a mathematics of how to live, right? Then it may become more obvious that it's not, there are not necessarily any prerequisites, even though of course in our current capitalist society, you know, not having a job is almost equal to, like, it's almost worse than, I don't know if that makes sense, but you probably get the...
Yeah, but it's funny because when you say that, technically there are people who don't have like their primary needs taken care of, don't have all the things that we think we need, and they are blissful. And in Ghana, we call them mad people. You see what I'm trying to say? It's like they exist, but I mean that's not necessarily an applicable definition.
I don't mean more them as I mean maybe someone like a monk, right? And
I agree.
The Buddhists of like 3,000 years ago, where it's sort of an intrinsic thing about life than a place to get to like how it is now, right? It's like a lot of Buddhists would say like, if you like you go there, you are trying to like learn how to meditate. Some of them say something like, "Oh, you do less to become mindful. Not that you are doing more. You are actually doing less. You are taking away expectations. You are taking away the feeling that, oh, every time say your stomach grumbles, it means you are hungry, right? You are taking away a lot of these things. And so some people actually, when they are in the lower points of their lives, go on these sort of trips to say maybe Tibet or something, because there they'll be living on subsistence food. They'll be doing all the things that if I didn't choose it, I would say I need those things.
It becomes
right?
how optional all those things you think you need
Exactly.
are. It's like they are not requirements.
Exactly. So it's not like me, Nyakubodoku, I would be able to do all these things if I didn't have all of this. Like I'll probably also be shit if I didn't, like shit as meditating, if I didn't have the privilege that I have. But it still doesn't take away the fact from me that there's still a possibility for it to extend beyond. It's just that, in the position I was thinking very differently, right? But there are sort of situations you could put me in that, or a human being in that, even without that specific hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
and even then, it's like that hierarchy. Even though you shouldn't let it rule you, but it shouldn't, having aspirations shouldn't be something that is shamed either. It's like take me for instance. Like I kind of remove myself from the kind of narrative playing out. I'm an observer, so I kind of really try to fully appreciate the distance. But at the same time, I'm here like, okay, listen, I'm an observer in this experience, but it's interesting. Let's wield it. Let's take full advantage of it. Through that, it means applying yourself. Like I want this. You know, you want that. You should want. If not, why are you here? It's like you didn't come here to be basic. You didn't come here to just like be there. Like you want to really take full advantage of this experience that you have, because it's very transient. You know, and it's you. So you don't want to also just get lost on the complete other side. Monks, we love monks. They are a very great example. But they are not, would you say they are using their life to the fullest potential? You could argue yes, to be honest. But while someone is doing that, it's not for everyone.
Yeah.
And maybe you can even integrate lessons from them. I mean, if somebody like, you know, there are people putting rockets on the moon and stuff, like monks aren't going to try and do that. But those things, in a sense, I wouldn't say they are necessary, but they are brilliant. They are beautiful. Like, and the person who did that had needs. And he had when things don't go as planned, that's considered a failure. So those kind of obstacles, you should rather kind of try to have fun with it instead of letting it rule you. Yeah. But it's very tricky. It's a delicate balance.
and that kind of leads me to sort of make this. I mean, I was making an observation when Neil was speaking. I think we also shouldn't confound being a simple person, for lack of better words, that monks, like a monk in Kathmandu, is a simple person, doesn't need much besides what the land offers and a few other things. and can meditate and can be mindful and can discover truths that most of the people in the world wouldn't be able to. We shouldn't confound that with being, in some kind of position of like either economic strife or in some position where your very survival is at stake or there's a question mark behind it. Like there's some people who are just born into war. Like you can be born into Syria and boom, like from day one you're struggling for your life and you almost do not have the mental bandwidth beyond, trying to survive the day, trying to find food that even the land does not produce. And in that case, and that's sort of why this prompt about Maslow's theory was a little profound because taking care of survival and having, thriving or thriving being the only thing you worry about, you're in a much, much more comfortable place than I would say a good chunk of the world, right? Who even finding clean water to drink or to cook with or to do whatever with becomes a chore that takes a significant portion of their day, right?
Yeah.
Where would you find the time to meditate? Or even where would you even begin to think about meditating? What William said was also brilliant. Like, yeah, these monks, to a large extent, is solipsistic. It's a very personal, I won't say selfish because somehow we've learned how to do these things through them. But it's a very solipsistic place to be where you're thinking and trying to be more internal. He gave an example of someone putting a rocket on the moon or like doing other things in the world. Those are things to aspire to also. So in as much as these monks and stuff are doing, very well in this space of meditation and mindfulness, they can be the example of how we should be,
Agreed.
That's so
I honestly
interesting.
don't think that's why when I was even giving the example of like public speaking, right? Mindfulness is not there. Mindfulness does help give some insight into what you can do, but it still doesn't, reach the end. The reason I'll still talk about it from this direction is because of like there are these Stoics like Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and Seneca. And Epictetus was a slave, right? And he speaks about Stoicism from a place where it makes you even feel bad to be privileged and still consider some things like obstacles, right, in your life. And so it's not that it's that's the best possible way. Like, what's the point here? It's kind of like the fact that somebody in that position, right, could do it is what is kind of making me feel like I cannot also take I cannot feel like I know so much about this mindfulness that I think it's only reserved for people like me. Because again, like most of even I do agree with like putting rockets on the moon, even our moral choices, right? This ethics, this morality that we've decided, all of it is what do you call it? It's the power of thought, right? It's the power of us getting lost in thoughts and talking about it and stuff. So it's all brilliant. But again, like in the grand scheme of what's possible in the universe, that's how I'm like looking at things, right? So speaking from a practical sense, if I was a psychotherapist and someone came to me and said I'm having a problem, of course, like mindfulness may not be the first. I'll say, oh yeah, mindfulness will solve your problem, right? It's not that silver bullet in that sense, but in the grand scheme of what's possible in the universe, it does seem like, because once we go like more than 2,000 years ago, almost all the things that we think we need right now, we're not there in that way, like the needs, right? We're not necessarily there in that way. People could live maybe 30 years and then die because maybe they didn't have clean drinking water, right? Like the person was born in war, in the midst of war in Syria. And they would still be okay with it. I'm not saying it's necessarily a good thing because I'll probably want to live longer if I can. But again, like in this, what seems possible in the scheme of the universe, the insight into let me use mindfulness doesn't tied necessarily.
One thing that you draw my attention to as well is that it's funny because a lot of the things we call quote unquote needs, we manufacture needs every day. Like there are conversations now about whether the internet should be a human right or not. I'm like, so all of a sudden now, if you are living in the world of today, you don't have the internet, your quality of life is lower. So the things on this hierarchy of needs are shifting by the day. It's artificial. We are creating things, and even something like that should highlight how removed we should view these things. We should be from these things, because you are literally deciding what things you want to aspire to or want by the day. There are still people who were like, okay, listen, into the internet is a lot. I'm not really trying to spend too much time on. For some, it's like, wow, I don't have this. My life is horrible. So there's a subjectivity aspect to
the
it, where it's
storytelling
like,
aspects too as well, I think.
exactly. And one other thing that I was thinking as well is like, of course, going back to the needs, like, spending time on these kind of practices, it's a contemplative practice, i.e., which it goes without saying that you need time on your hands. And that's why people travel to all these exotic locations to kind of remove themselves from society, because they want the space to think about these things, to be free of all the things that distract them. You need time to because it's a lot, because you
And
are
it's a
grown.
distracted society we are in right now.
Exactly, which was actually the point I was even heading to. It's like, you are, from the minute you are born, you are being conditioned to kind of be so attached to your surroundings and your relationships and your ego and your sense of self. Society doesn't give you the chance to be as fluid as we really are, and it's so, getting to that point. For instance, like, we that seem to have ideas about this, I don't think we can all say that at the age of 10 or 15 or whatever we knew this. Like, for the most part of our lives, actually for probably 50% of our lives or longer, we were still being part of the condition, quote unquote, in the matrix. It's like we were in there. It seems almost involuntary. So that wiring, and maybe at some point in our lives, we respectively had moments where we're like, okay, no, this is funny. There's something going on here. That red pill, blue pill moments, like, where it's like, okay, no, there's something funny here, like, and you need that kind of time. There are two ways that I've realized, and there are probably more that people kind of get to this. Some people get to it because they have just so much time that they are like, wow, they have so much excess and abundance that they realize the trivialness of everything. It's, and the other side is people get into such deep depths of despair where they kind of remove themselves. They're like, okay, fuck all of this. So it's like opposite sides of the spectrum,
There's also
just
one
to
other
wake you up.
I want to add of like some people who feel this, and I think someone called this like the sublime, when like maybe people are on top of a mountain, right? And it's very easy to see your insignificance from the top of the mountain. Some people report this sublime experience that sort of triggers the need to sort of start introspecting a bit more into their lives, which
That's
a
true.
bunch of people are
One other
from.
thing,
Yeah.
One other thing I wanted to mention, we were talking about how, like, it's either like you're putting rockets on the moon, or solving some disease, or you're a monk. And I'm like, maybe we don't give enough credit to the in-betweens. It's possible. Like, a typical example is someone like Steve Jobs. I think it's very well documented how passionate and how much of a believer he was in these Eastern traditions. Like, he was literally wearing the same outfit every day. He was like simple, quote unquote, but look at the kind of things like he achieved with his life. So, like, I just wanted to bring that up as an example, where it's like, you don't need to go full on monk. You don't need to go full on like attachment to, you can have some in between. And maybe that's more of what we should be aspiring to. How do we combine the fact that we know this is, quote unquote, all an illusion, and we shouldn't take it too seriously and be removed from our emotions, and then combine that with the knowledge that, no, this is like, this life is beautiful and it's purposeful. You can use it, but using it requires wielding some level of attachment, and some level of ego to kind of navigate it. And that's a balance that I think it's tricky. But going back to the general question we were asking, I guess the bigger question was why this doesn't work for everyone, the things that get in the way. And I think what we seem to be alluding to is that I think people are at varying levels of recognition of how much of an illusion it is, or how much the space in between who they think they are and their awareness behind that experience. People are at varying levels of that realization, and that kind of affects how effective this practice will be in your life. So then the question becomes, how do you get people to quote unquote believe in this stuff more. Realize that no, because it seems so airy fairy. We live in societies that kind of completely go against this. Like some of the things we're talking about now might seem taboo in the context of certain religions. So it's like there are so many blocks. There are so many blocks that prevent people from accessing this kind of like I wouldn't call it objective truth, but this kind of unbiased observation. Like you were just like you just did some introspection and this is what you found, free of any doctrine.
Yeah.
Interesting. And that sort of leads to sort of the next prompt, which says, we're well aware that mindfulness and meditation practices are not as widespread. Obviously, not majority of people in the world practice these things, even though it's one of the oldest, ideologies, if you will, from the East. So William started by mentioning some of the factors that may be affecting this accessibility to such practices. Like, for example, neighbor, what do you think could be some other reasons?
Access. Let's see. Can you come back to me on this one?
One other thing I want to add is that sometimes I guess it all comes down to the current story we are telling ourselves. We don't even have room. Some people don't have room to embrace these things because they have to overwrite or unlearn certain things. So I think maybe the conversation needs to even start from there. How do you even unlearn the things that are preventing you from getting to that point? Like, I mean, you could have a conversation with a Christian. They are so in belief, they believe in what they believe so much, where it's like, okay, they are not even going to believe this. Like, like you're like, okay, listen, when I'm upset, I pray. Like, I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
Like, like I'm like, when I'm upset, I go on my knees. Everybody has all these other religions have their own way of addressing these things. Leave it to God. All these things seems very powerless. And people, so that's one way of looking at it. There's something that needs to be overwritten. So because think about it, it would have been simple if you are talking to people who don't have any attachments to anything. You're just trying to show them this. But Absolutely. You are dealing with a society that already has preconceptions. It's not a blank slate. So you are already fighting forces that have stood the test of time. I'm talking about religions, family structures, cultural norms, certain things that rob people of their awareness of their power over selves. And I think maybe that's a place to start from. And then you can that would segue into all these factors that are hindering the accessibility of this.
Awesome. Yeah, I definitely agree. I definitely agree on that. I think we've definitely found common ground on that specific point. I'm just interested in knowing, how does that play a role in reducing accessibility? The fact that people are afflicted with something, be it emotional, physical, or just economic affliction.
It's like the framework of the understanding is there's a current framework, and what we are talking about is not compatible with that framework. So either that framework has to be wiped off or updated or made more fluid enough to accommodate elements. It doesn't even have to take everything we are saying. Like, the parts that they identify with as true and that they feel they can benefit from. But if their framework does not have that understanding, maybe they grew up in an environment where they were, maybe ridiculed all their life. That's one example. It doesn't have to be religion. It could literally be your upbringing. You see, like we were saying, for the first maybe few years of your life till you decide to question your reality, quote unquote, you are being conditioned. The conditioning starts from birth. Like, you are touching something and they say, no, don't do that. It's like, okay, then you learn, okay, I don't need to do that. You have been conditioned, and it starts like that. And it's like a snowball effect. It's a snowball effect all the way up into your adulthood. So undoing that thing, I think is maybe what we are underestimating, how entrenched these things can be.
I actually have a story that's kind of matches what you're saying about Christianity. So my brother mentioned meditation in his church once, because he's on the board of his church, and we was talking to one of his friends, and he mentioned meditation, and his friend was like, hey, meditation, what do you mean by that? Hey, those woo kind of things, right? And he was looking at it from, a Christian point of view, and my brother even had to be like, oh, the word meditation is even in the Bible, like meditate on the word. right? Very different context there, but that was a thing that sort of could calm him down for that moment, right? In order for my brother to be able to like now talk to him, right? And I think all of these things are kind of at play, like what William was saying. It's like all of these things are at play when it comes to trying to tell someone that like meditation works, or someone reading about
Yeah.
it and wanting to try for themselves.
For me, it's very clear in my own experience. Before I got here, a big chunk of my early practice was unlearning my religious beliefs. I grew up in a Christian home. Like, it's like that was the indoctrination that was forced on me throughout my upbringing. So the first chunk, like I said, the current framework I have now was just simply not compatible. It doesn't fit in. They could not coexist. So the first few years were just unlearning, and some people have defined their whole reality around these things. That unlearning is essentially literally throwing everything they believe in. And for some, that's a scary leap. It's like because it's very comfy. It's very comfy being where you are. Like, a lot of religious people are comfy in their religious bubble, and it's a very comfy place because you have a community there as well. And that community feeling can trump the sense that we might feel now, in the sense that people, that it's very seductive, that sense of community. You almost don't want to leave, and then it's like, wow, you want to abandon everything there and come an outcast, because all their social networks and their social immediate family and the rest are of that viewpoint. So you are essentially asking them to ostracize them from their own community if they want to abandon all of these things. But unless there may be some more subversive ways to introduce these practices, because I also don't want it to seem like this is not what we are talking about is really just being aware of your own thoughts and assessing your own emotions and creating a separation between what you are experiencing and then the awareness behind it. I don't think you need to throw all your religions away just to get the benefits of this. I don't think so. We don't want to make it seem like it's one or the other. But I think there are definitely some hindrances. But I think, so I would say that actually, maybe we're not exploring how compatible it might be with even some of the most quote unquote toxic beliefs of today. We are really just talking about being aware of your own thoughts and understanding that you are not your experience. I don't think you need to throw away your whole religion to
actually something
believe
funny
that.
to that. This guy says, the Simpson Harris guy and it also talks to the point of like putting a rocket on the moon, right? So there were people in civilizations who used to sort of take all the ayahuasca and things for rituals, and yet they still believed they needed to maybe like sacrifice a third born, in each generation, and so the mindfulness itself does not necessarily even guarantee you be happy. If you have a society where you are like having a good time, you have your friends, so it's interesting to look at it from that perspective as well for me.
Even happiness and being excited, and it's a state of being that it's not the nominal position. I feel like the nominal position is peace. Like sadness and excitement they are up and down the scale, but the center point is literally just equanimity and peace. Like that's where you really want to be. Like, sometimes it's being excited is a state of being that I'd rather be at peace than be happy. I don't know if that makes sense. I'd much rather be at peace than being happy. And because think about it, we're talking about removing yourself from the experience and being the person observing, I say quote unquote person, but the entity observing. And it's like, okay, that comes from a place of stillness. And excitement and happiness are not still emotions. I don't feel like they are still. You see, so it's just making that point. But all in all, like I said, I think to sum that point up, I think it's just people's current frameworks not being compatible with this, or other elements that are throwing them off this way of thinking are what are preventing it from being more widely accessible. How that changes, perhaps maybe people trying to take maybe not viewing it as a complete readjustment of their entire lives, but just looking at it practically and saying, listen, perhaps if I spend more time with my thoughts, I can diffuse and detangle my emotions from my experience, and or from the awareness behind the experience. And there is some wisdom and some usefulness in that, without maybe throwing everything out. So maybe trying to advocate more for that could help.
Yeah, and I also think we are on a generally good path, because there's been a lot of studies now that are showing that for almost all the quote unquote successful people that we point to and look for advice, most of them mention sort of a mindfulness practice, right? And they mentioned that it's usually sometimes even the top 5 of what made them successful, right? I got this book recently called Tribe of Mentors. So it's just a bunch of this Tim Ferriss, instead of writing a book himself, he basically just sent questions to random people like, Gary Vaynerchuk, Malcolm Gladwell, random people, and then he just like put it into a book. And a lot of what most of them had and mentioned was like a mindfulness practice, but it seemed like for most of them it happened within the past sort of 5 to 10 years where they really started to understand mindfulness and it had that profound effect on them. So I think in general society is moving in that direction. It's passing this phase of the glorified stress ball phase, but in a few years
that's
I'm
true.
optimistic about
The truth can be hidden forever.
It can't. And I do agree, William, with what you're saying. Humans enjoy cohesiveness over everything. They'd rather follow the squad than to, go ahead and experiment with what they might be truly feeling. Also, people might be stuck in their ways, if you will. I want to say for 2 reasons. For one, fear, and 2, ego, which would probably be another set of topics for another podcast episode. But these 2 things end up trapping people, letting them remain in some kind of thought pattern that they can't really leave. And that's one of the hindrances, for something like meditation and mindfulness. And I guess, something to explore. But I do agree that unless you start peeling back those layers and being true to yourself and being like, hey, honestly, let me put aside my ego and my fear and really go out and explore, it'll be hard to actually open yourself up to this thing.
Certainly.
And I'm talking about
The
mass, the overwhelming majority of people who reject this ideology. That's who sort of this is directed at.
I actually really like that in terms of like adding the fear and ego, because I think fear is a huge part, or even called maybe uncertainty, right? Uncertainty about the next moment, about the future, right? And I think that's where even the peace really comes in handy, because now you kind of already know that, okay, this next second, whatever happens, I'll be fine, right? But then that uncertainty of the future, the next moment is a huge part. I agree with that.
Yeah. Unconditional peace of mind. That's where you want to be, because then your emotional state is irrespective of your circumstance and experience. And that's where you want to be, in the sense that it's peaceful. But to get there, it takes a lot of practice. So I think we can kind of wrap up by acknowledging that, at least, that, okay, yes, this is something everyone can stand to benefit from. But people are at varying levels of conduciveness for this kind of practice. And perhaps maybe people giving it more time, or maybe trying to fit it into their framework of understanding, might be a better start than trying to convince people to override their entire beliefs. Because one way or another, if you even incorporate a bit of it, it's a seed that will grow. You say the truth can be hidden forever. The world is generally trending towards a less religious society. In general, people are becoming more facts-based, which because these things we are talking about, if they are true, they'll stand the test of time. So in that sense, it's a seed that will grow. So all in all, I think we found some common ground on this. And I think we've kind of harmonized our viewpoints, and I think what main conclusions, let's run through. So then we have a few minutes. Run through, I'd say, okay, yes, it is something everyone can benefit from. And the things that get in our way are what? Ourselves. And our attachments to ourselves, fear and ego. Yeah. Fear is the opposite of love. And you can view fear as the act of rejection of the now, and love as the act of accepting the now. And that is the hack, like Nee said, essentially accepting the now and the uncertainty, because reality is uncertainty, if you think about it. But going back to like the actual practical steps of like, okay, that person, individual today who is suffering PTSD from some experience that happened back then, and they can't find the strength to come out of it or to remove themselves from that situation. What would we say to that person based on what we have discussed now?
Yeah, I think it's a very complex thing to even begin to
That's true.
unpack.
Because
Just mainly because
it's
we've not
tangled.
experienced
It's
it.
tangled. It's very tangled. It's very tangled in their minds. But I think that the simplest thing to say is it does take time to unwind these things in your mind. You spend your whole life building this identity of yourself as a traumatized person. You identify with that as an identity. You view yourself as that. Maybe starting by letting go of that identity more. Like you are more than your trauma. You are beyond that. Like there's
Yep.
more to your entire existence than that said traumatic event, no matter how traumatic it could be. Not to downplay any trauma, but no matter how traumatic it could be, you are probably doing yourself a disservice by hinging your entire identity on that set event or set of events. So free yourself, let go, free yourself, and perhaps spend more time distancing yourself from your experience and just trying to see the beauty that this life offers you when you can be the fluid being that you really, really are. When you allow yourself to be that. I think, but like you said, Ellie, it's certainly complicated. But
Yeah.
I think at the risk of not running on too long, the simplest advice, perhaps, that would be a starting point at the very least. But then, and also not underestimating the discipline involved in the experience. Like Nee said, and maybe Nee, you can sum up with this: it's not a glorified stress ball.
Yeah.
Yeah, honestly, yeah, it's not a glorified stress, but I like what you said though about sort of the PTSD. Honestly, my advice for them would be go and see a psychotherapist because I have zero insight.
True, they know what they are doing. They know what they're doing.
But most of them too would sort of recommend this sort of trying to help you tell a different story, right, about your life. That's why they may not necessarily even recommend maybe medical meds sometimes, but they keep talking to you. They keep asking you, "Oh, why did you just say that?" Right? It's like, why did you just maybe implicate yourself in that situation? Right? And then maybe with time, as you were saying, with the truth, the attachment to the story may unwind, and then with discipline, if that exists.
Ellie, do you want to wrap up for us?
Well, yeah, I could attempt, but feel free to add on. But all in all, I think we've found common ground in the fact that yes, everyone can benefit from meditation and mindfulness, provided you're open enough to it. Of course, just like anything else, there are a few that would, if you will, fall through the cracks for one reason or the other. But I think we've arrived at the conclusion that
A good
most
average.
people, a good average at least, yes, a good
Good
average
Like
can benefit from it. Yeah.
Okay,
So,
thank you guys for listening to the Common Ground podcast. We're going to try and be speaking more on topics of this nature. Like we said, topics that are relevant to our time. So subscribe and then keep up. If you have any topic ideas, send them over and we'll give them some consideration. We're always open to fresh ideas. And we're also open to having guests on this. So if you want to recommend someone who is knowledgeable about a topic, because we want the most knowledgeable people to join, and then we can discuss, or not so knowledgeable. It's fine. That's fine too. But yeah, thank you for spending time with us, and we'll all talk soon.